Peace, gentle friends, and welcome you all to Essential Reading, a series on YouTube where we look at the absolute key texts to read if you want to be really informed in the works of a certain writer or a certain movement in literature. And today we're talking about Shakespeare, right at the top of the English literature canon. You can't claim to be well read if you've never read any Shakespeare, or indeed watched Shakespeare, because I think it's important to remember that Shakespeare was meant to be experienced on a stage and not necessarily read from a page, and it's good to do both those things. So just before we begin and we talk about what texts of Shakespeare to look at, I'd like to tell you how you can access them for free. The Folger's Shakespeare Library online will provide you with online versions of all of Shakespeare's texts, or indeed Project Gutenberg, which supplies texts for free as well, classic texts. And you can find performances of many of Shakespeare's plays here on YouTube. Now, you might not want to go out and do what I have done and acquire a copy of the complete works of Shakespeare. Surely reading that from beginning to end is a bit of a big ask. I mean, just look how tiny the text is. Shakespeare wrote 38 plays, 154 sonnets, and at least 2 major long poems. And when I say long, they are long. So it would be a bit of a tall order to read all that to begin with. So at the end of this video, we're going to look at the top 10 texts by Shakespeare that you should read to really know about Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare's work divides loosely into several genres: comedy, which was the first genre that he wrote in, tragedy, and his most admired plays tend to be tragedies, like, for example, Macbeth, King Lear, Othello. He wrote romance, and romance is neither a comedy nor a tragedy, but has elements of both and a little bit of an element of fairy magic as well. He, of course, wrote poetry. He wrote the so-called problem plays, which are called problem plays because they don't really fit any defined genre. He wrote plays about English history, and he also wrote plays about classical history. So we're going to hear a bit about all these genres and which are the key texts within them. So who was William Shakespeare? Well, he was the son of a glove maker, John Shakespeare, and he's traditionally thought of as having been born on St George's Day, England's national day, in 1564. He definitely died on St George's Day in April 1616, aged only 52, but he left behind a huge amount of work and a huge amount of insight into the human condition. He didn't start out as a writer. He was actually an actor who decided he was going to write his own material, and he became quite a mover and shaker in the world of theatre at the time. Eventually his company would go on to buy the Globe Theatre in 1599, which you can still visit today. So he had his work in London and his family life in Stratford upon Avon. Of course, he famously married a lady called Anne Hathaway when he was only 18. They had 3 children, but unfortunately none of his descendants survived. So there are no living descendants of William Shakespeare today that we know of, unless he had a few illegitimate children running around. So when he started to write, he started with comedies because those were what tended to be commercially successful in his day. And he was actually, though a great artist, influenced by such things as commerce. He was also influenced by Christopher Marlowe and Thomas Kyd and other prolific playwrights of his day. From 1594, his plays were sold in sort of cheap editions called quarto editions, and they're called quarto because the paper was folded in 4. And these weren't very reliable. They were often made up of the sort of memories of actors, what they thought the lines were. But what's interesting about these quarto editions was that Shakespeare's name really sold them. So remember, at this point in history, the printing press is something quite new. Being able to buy texts is something that's just opening up to the general public. And so Shakespeare really becomes one of the first celebrity authors whose name actually markets his material. Now, since the quarto texts weren't that reliable, Shakespeare's friends John Hemming and Henry Condell, who were fellow actors, published the so-called folio edition in 1623, a few years after Shakespeare's death, and it's considered to be a more reliable edition, and most modern editions will sort of be based on it rather than the quarto editions. So when Shakespeare started writing, it was pretty important that he find himself a patron and get some money into the theatre company's kitty. So he had to suck up to Elizabeth I, and later to her successor, James I of England and VI of Scotland. And so his early plays tend to focus on the failure of leadership of earlier kings to sort of justify the Tudor regime. And so he writes about Richard III and really describes him as a bit of a monster, and he writes about Henry VI, for example. His style in writing drama is characterised, like many of his contemporaries, in blank verse. So it's poetry, but it doesn't rhyme. And that helps the actors to remember it because it has this really strong meter going through it called iambic pentameter. Now, an iamb is a strong syllable followed by a weak syllable. So, for example, we have, what a piece of work is a man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god. So you can tell that there is a meter running through those words. Now, as we say, the very first genre he wrote in was comedy, although people tend to prefer to read his tragedies today. But he focused on this as a playwright, but he could incorporate some tragic themes and some serious themes into his comedy as well. He actually was the pioneer of the genre of romantic comedy, so the next time you watch a rom-com on Netflix, that sort of harks back to Shakespeare. You may not think it when you're watching it. And the idea of a plucky heroine who outwits her male wooer is a big theme in Shakespearean rom-coms. In The Two Gentlemen of Verona, which appeared between 1590 and 1594, Julia, who would have been played by a boy, because remember there were no actresses in those days, the female parts were generally played by young males, disguises herself as a man in order to follow her lover Proteus from Verona to Milan. She sees him paying attention to Sylvia, his best friend Valentine's paramour. He's eventually brought round by his generous friend and by the loyal and chaste women. The theme of a young woman in male apparel appears in The Merchant of Venice and also As You Like It and Twelfth Night. It's a big theme in Shakespeare. So when you think about it, gender, when you have only men on the stage, becomes a bit of a theme because you're going to have a man playing a woman who's playing a man, which, is going to be a good source of comedy. Now, the source for The Two Gentlemen of Verona is Diana by Jorge de Montemayor, who was a Spanish prose romance. And it's important to remember Shakespeare never wrote an original story. He used other people's stories and he used sources such as Holinshed's Chronicles in order to create drama. The classically inspired play The Comedy of Errors, which appeared between 1589 and 94, takes its inspiration from Plautus' farce Menechmi, which means twins. So one twin, Antipholus, is searching for his lost brother with his servant Dromio, who has also lost his twin. The comedy looks at superficial identity, but also at self-knowledge, so identity inside and out. The difficulties are resolved by a marriage at the end, and that tends to be what happens in a Shakespearean comedy or an Elizabethan or Jacobean comedy, that there is a happy ending involving a marriage, and that's how we define it as a comedy, whereas I suppose in our age we think of a comedy as something that is funny, and some of Shakespeare's comedies very much are, but it's really that marriage at the end that makes it fit into that genre. Men and women's experiences of each other are much discussed in The Comedy of Errors, especially by Antipholus' wife, Adriana, and her sister, Luciana. There's an early romantic comedy by Shakespeare called Love's Labour's Lost, which appeared between 1588 and 97, which actually owes much to the comedy dramatist John Lilly. In this play, the King of Navarre is visited by the Princess of France and her ladies-in-waiting, and a diplomatic trip becomes a game of courtship. The young women are self-assured and know which young men they intend to marry, so they've set their caps at very particular chaps. The young men, however, are not so savvy and vainly try to throw over romantic love for more serious aims. The women eventually forgive their foolishness. So women are kind of long-suffering in Shakespearean comedies. Now, a really problematic Shakespearean comedy is The Taming of the Shrew. The word shrew meaning as a sort of outspoken woman, and the idea that we can tame a woman pretty distasteful to a modern audience, and some of Shakespeare's work is a little bit uncomfortable today. If you think of perhaps The Merchant of Venice and the depiction of the Jewish character Shylock, for example, there's elements of anti-Semitism which were rife in Shakespeare's society. So when we look at Shakespeare through the prism of the 21st century, we won't always like what we see. But in The Taming of the Shrew, Bianca's father wants to marry her off to a wealthy suitor, but she falls for a lonely tutor. Now, the sort of accepted norm of the day was that the eldest sister had to be married before the younger sister could be. So the tutor, who happens to actually be the wealthy Lucentio, talks his friend into courting Bianca's shrewish, as she's known, elder sister Kate, who happens to have renounced all men. So this friend, Petruchio, decides to pursue Kate and aim to marry her so that his friend can marry his love interest. Now, Kate arguably loses the battle of wits with Petruchio, but she ends up in a stronger position than Bianca because she has a relationship that's based on wit and true companionship, which her sister's is basically a bit more of a flimsy romantic ideal. The comedy Much Ado About Nothing was written sometime around 1598 to 9. Again, it's structured around a double plot, which we quite often get in Shakespeare. We could see that in The Taming of the Shrew, we have the plot between Bianca and Lucentio and Petruchio and Kate. Here we have the structure of the plot of Hero and Claudio, with the aristocratic Claudio attempting to woo Hero, but being fooled by Don John into believing that she has had many lovers. She is not a chaste woman. Hero's cousin Beatrice is sceptical about men, but is courted by the marriage skeptic Benedict. Now, there was a very famous movie adaptation of Much Ado About Nothing, which starred Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson back in the 90s, and that sort of launched a fad for Shakespeare movies for a time. As You Like It, another famous Shakespeare comedy, which appeared between 1598 and 1600, uses familiar and successful devices from Shakespeare, such as cross-dressing, which is obviously a big thing in Shakespeare. Rosalind, the daughter of a banished duke, wants to marry Orlando, who's her social inferior, but a decent if not entirely well-educated man. She disguises herself as a man, Ganymede, and offers him advice on his love life, and that's very Shakespearean. Twelfth Night is a very famous Shakespearean comedy, and Twelfth Night, of course, refers to the 12th night of Christmas, the final night of the Christmas celebrations. And this play appeared between 1600 and 1602, and again, it's about a female in disguise. Viola is shipwrecked on the coast of Illyria and must disguise herself as a man to secure a place in the court of Duke Orsino, with whom she falls in love. As Cesario, that's her name as a man, she encourages him to stop pining for his unrequited love, Countess Olivia, and inspires a sense of friendship and love. So Britannica tells us the transition from same-sex friendship to heterosexual union is a constant in Shakespearean comedy. The woman is the self-knowing, constant, loyal one. The man needs to learn a lot from the woman. Of course, there's always going to be overtones of homoeroticism when the woman is played by a man, and Shakespeare goes with that in his comedy quite often, and modern producers also tend to run with that. Now, another comedy worth looking at is The Merry Wives of Windsor, which appeared between 1597 and 1601. It's set not in a classical land, which Shakespeare's other comedies tend to be, but in closer to home, Windsor, a sort of prosaic setting for a play at the time. People like to go to the theatre to be taken to somewhere escapist, and here Shakespeare talks about what's going on at home. Rumour has it that Elizabeth I wanted to see Falstaff in love, that she'd asked for that little plot twist. Falstaff, of course, being a comedic character from the plays about Henry IV. So Falstaff is outwitted in this play by the witty women of the title, Mistress Alice Ford and Mistress Margaret Page. So this is a very English comedy. Of course, we associate Shakespeare more with tragedies, Many of you might have read Macbeth or Romeo and Juliet, for example, at school. And we tend to think of tragedy when we think of Shakespeare. Of course, his biggest play is Hamlet, which is right at the apex of the English literature canon. But he actually started his career in writing tragedy with something arguably a bit less successful, Titus Andronicus, which appeared between 1589 and 92. Its theme, structure and language reflect a very popular play of the time by Thomas Kyd called The Spanish Tragedy, which was a so-called revenge tragedy. And in a revenge tragedy, the murder or rape of a family member or dear one leads the protagonist to owe a duty of revenge. And generally, this protagonist becomes more ruthless and morally compromised and often mad as they seek revenge against a canny opponent. So in Titus Andronicus, the title character's sons are butchered and his daughter is raped. It's a grisly, gruesome play, baking people in pies before either Sweeney Todd or Game of Thrones came along. It's pretty blood-soaked, and it lacks the subtlety and sort of psychological drama of some of Shakespeare's later plays. Now, Christopher Marlowe's character Barabbas from The Jew of Malta might have inspired the villain Aaron the Moor in Titus Andronicus. So at that point, Shakespeare is still looking at what other people are doing in the field of tragedy, although he goes so much further than the other tragedians of the day in terms of the sort of psychological realism of what he's writing. So we mentioned earlier on Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet, people, is not, I repeat, not a love story. It's a story about a teenage crush that goes horribly, horribly wrong. After all, Romeo had had strings of paramours before he ended up with Juliet. Anyway, I digress. So the writing of Romeo and Juliet between 1594 and 6 coincided with Shakespeare writing A Midsummer Night's Dream, a much lighter comedic piece. The characters are more reflective of comedy, and their classical origins and the family's desire for social advancement is something you see in Shakespeare's comedies. Now he puts it into the field of tragedy. The play does contain these comical elements, and it actually can be quite bawdy in places. It's a little bit smutty in some lines. The unrealistic opening figure of Romeo, who at that point is in love with fair Rosalind before he moves on to Juliet, for example, demonstrates this. But Juliet's open, honest and plucky character is reminiscent of the heroine of a romance. When Romeo chooses to avenge the death of Mercutio by killing Tybalt, though, that's when the mood changes and it becomes a tragedy. So if you were a member of that early audience, you would have had an expectation watching this play that it was going to become a comedy, and actually it turns into a tragedy, which is why we have to have that speech at the start about the star-crossed lovers, so that the audience are not expecting to laugh through it. Now, one of the most read of Shakespeare's tragedies was Macbeth, written in 1602, and it focuses on how power corrupts the soul. So the source for it was Holinshed's Chronicles. It's not a historically accurate account. There's no historical information that tells us the Macbeths were monsters. What Shakespeare is interested in is that kind of fall from grace and the power grab and the guilt. And he focuses in on a few characters because of this. It's a good place to start with Shakespearean tragedy because it doesn't have the same number of subplots, and it's a little bit shorter than something like Hamlet. So what happens in the action of Macbeth, which I'm sure you know, is that the previously decent, upstanding Macbeth descends morally as he ascends to the throne, following the murder of Duncan, which was a breach of his duty to the king and the laws of hospitality. Also, Duncan is a relative, so in the society of Macbeth's time, and also for a Tudor audience, or actually we're into an early Jacobean audience in 1606, pardon me, these are horrifying breaches of social norms. His wife, Lady Macbeth, of course, eggs him on and is sort of the power behind the throne. She actually accuses him of being unmanly for not wanting to murder this relative who's staying in his house, and she encourages his path away from grace until she herself succumbs to guilt. She does have a social conscience. She's a socially skilled, intelligent character. The thing about Lady Macbeth that's quite interesting is, like the comedies, we see this idea of sex being brought into play when she says, unsex me now. So I'm not going to behave like a woman. I'm going to be a man for a moment. And the inference is men are more capable of murder and women should be nurturing. And she talks about being a mother, although we don't see the Macbeths with any children and they have no heirs. So we assume some kind of tragedy has happened there. Now, of course, the big Shakespearean tragedy is Hamlet, written between 1599 and 1691. It's considered Shakespeare's greatest tragedy and one of the most important texts in the whole of English literature. It's a revenge tragedy in the style of Kyd, in that the protagonist must avenge a terrible wrong that has been done, the murder of his father by his uncle, so that his father can steal the throne. So Hamlet is not on the throne after the death of his father. He's either mad or pretending to be so, basically to keep himself alive. What is interesting about Hamlet is, in a typical revenge tragedy, the character falls from grace, and as they pursue revenge, they become tainted by it and they sort of descend into a moral dark place. Hamlet still retains his soul right to the end, and the burden of having to avenge his father affects him very badly psychologically. Now, coming in on the heels of Hamlet, two other Shakespearean tragedies, Othello and King Lear. Othello, most likely written in 1604, is the tale of Desdemona, the only daughter of the Senator Brabantio of Venice, who elopes with a darker skinned man, a Moor, her senior by many years, so not considered to be a suitable partner by her society at all. Her father actually dies of a broken heart. Sexual jealousy destroys the relationship between Desdemona and Othello. Othello is the tragically flawed hero of classical literature reinvented for Shakespeare's times. King Lear is probably the most nihilistic of Shakespeare's plays. It's very bleak. It's the story of an elderly king who's basically losing his power and treated really without love by two of his three daughters, and the one daughter who does love him, he treats pretty badly. So it's a family completely falling apart, and it's about that movement into old age and the loss of power and autonomy that comes with that. So we mentioned before Shakespeare's English history plays and how they were mostly written to secure some funding from Elizabeth I and James I, both of whom were prolific funders and patrons of the arts. And Shakespeare really made this genre his own. It had no formal rules, whereas the classical tradition recognised the two broad genres of comedy and tragedy. Tragedy focused on the lives of great heroes and was often set in supernatural worlds, whereas comedy dramatised the everyday, tended to end with a marriage. It often lampooned the lives of the audience themselves. And so Shakespeare's English history plays don't really fit into this, and he tries to combine both tragic and comedic elements because real life has both those things. But he's not attempting to write real life in writing his history plays. Historical accuracy is not really Shakespeare's bag. He's more interested in the psychology of the characters. And so we need to be careful about conflating Shakespeare with real history. You could see around the time of the discovery of the body of Richard III, for example, that so much of our opinion of Richard III comes from Shakespeare, although I pretty much believe Richard III did off the princes in the Tower because, means, motive, all that kind of thing. Who else could have done it? But I digress. So we have to remember that the topics that Shakespeare was discussing at the time were fairly recent English history, and so would have had the impact on the audience of someone talking about, say, the Iraq War now. The history plays were very successful commercially on stage, and that helped them to become a genre. Editors of the complete works of Shakespeare way back in 1636 divided his plays into comedies, tragedies and histories. And Britannica tells us Shakespeare in 1590 or thereabouts had really owned one viable model for the English history play, an anonymous and sprawling drama called The Famous Victories of Henry V. 1583 to 88, that told the saga of Henry IV's son, Prince Hal, from the days of his adolescent rebellion down through his victory over the French at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. In other words, the material that Shakespeare would later use in writing three major plays: Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, and Henry V. So he did like to write series of plays, a bit like going to the cinema today to see something like the Lord of the Rings trilogy or Star Wars. He liked the installment thing. It was good for commercial reasons. He also wrote a play about Henry VI, who was the last Lancastrian king in the War of the Roses, who's seen as quite ineffectual, and actually his wife, Margaret of Anjou, he's really running the show. Now, Henry VI was deposed by Edward IV, the Yorkist, in the play Richard III. And so this creates a tetralogy of plays from Henry VI parts 1, 2 and 3 through to Richard III. English audiences loved to see the story of Lord Talbot battling in France against the witch Joan of Arc. Now you can imagine that the French would have viewed that story slightly differently, and her lover in the play in Henry VI part 1. Annoying the French is a age-long tradition of the English, of course. So Henry VI's court involved quite a lot of factionalism, and the early death of his father had meant that he became king before he was really prepared for leadership. So there's a failure of leadership there, there's a vacuum. And the weak and inefficient leadership of the Plantagenets, the family that preceded the Tudors, generally is a theme of the history plays and shows support for the Tudor regime. Now, some other playwrights such as Marlowe and Kidd had pretty much got themselves killed or arrested by annoying the Tudors. So if he's going to be out there in public putting out works, Shakespeare really wants it to be known that he's not going to be doing anything to annoy the Tudors, basically. So the Wars of the Roses in Shakespeare's writing are seen as an inevitable result of the failings of the previous leaders. Like when Edward IV, referred to as the son of York, because in real life he had a sigil that was the sun on his shield. And at his first most famous victory, there was like a strange meteorological phenomenon where it looked like there was a double sun in the sky, hence the son of York. And the audience at the time would have got that reference. He led the cadet branch of the House of Plantagenet, the House of York, against Henry's House of Lancaster. And what ended up happening in the end was, of course, Henry Tudor is of the Lancastrian strand, but he marries Elizabeth of York. And so then you get the Tudor Rose, and those two factions are brought together, which in a play sounds like a very happy ending, but we know that a lot went down under the Tudors as well. Now, the rise of the murderous Richard, Duke of Gloucester, to become Richard III, the last Yorkist king before Henry Tudor comes along, is very politically motivated. England was experiencing a shift in national identity at the time, and the English history plays appealed to audiences as well as to the incumbent regime. The reign of Elizabeth I had been so much more secure than that of her predecessors. She was on the throne for a long time. Her father, Henry VIII, had pretty much bankrupted the country, and it has now become prosperous. So this sense of national pride is burgeoning, and Shakespeare patches into that. Elizabeth's victory over the Spanish Armada was seen as her enjoying the favour of God, and by extension, England enjoying the favour of God. Holinshed's Chronicles, which was Shakespeare's major source for his history plays, celebrated England as a major Protestant power in Europe, led by a gifted, wise and popular queen. Shakespeare leaned on it heavily, and he's not, as I say, interested in actual historical fact. Shakespeare was a propagandist, basically. Let's put it that bluntly. But wanting to make money and wanting to stay alive were probably his motivation for that. Unfortunately, his historical dramas have been conflated with actual history, and as Britannica states, because these historical plays of Shakespeare in the early 1590s were so intent on telling the saga of emergent nationhood, they exhibit a strong tendency to identify villains and heroes. Shakespeare is writing dramas, not schoolbook texts, and he freely alters dates and facts and emphases, so it's a bit like the argument that appeared a few years ago about the historical accuracy of The Crown and people taking the events of that TV show and its slant for fact. We do that with Shakespeare too. Henry Tudor, at the end of Richard III, is a pious man who loves his York wife and a noble forebear to the later Tudors, including his granddaughter Elizabeth. The title page of Richard III describes the play as a tragedy, as did the title pages of Shakespeare's other history plays. It doesn't have a traditionally tragic ending in that the perceived rescue of England by Henry Tudor is basically a happy ending, returning the country to decency. In this sense, Britannica likens the early history plays to tragicomedies or romances. However, Shakespeare went on to write Henry VIII in 1613, and we are told it is as much romance as history play, according to Britannica. Elizabeth I's birth is seen as engineered by Providence, so God sent her to England, although she had died a decade earlier than the play was written, but still this noble, wise queen is lauded. Her birth ends the play and is seen to justify the relationship with Anne Boleyn and the breaking of England's relationship with the papacy and much of Europe that preceded it. So all that turmoil was worth it because England got Elizabeth I. Shakespeare's long poems are perhaps not his most famous works, but they are really, really worth reading. They're both on a classical theme. Venus and Adonis, which appeared in 1593, and The Rape of Lucrece, which appeared in 1594. So between 1592 and 1594, theatres had closed due to an outbreak of plague, and so that gives Shakespeare time to work on a long poem. And remember, at that point in history, poetry was really considered to be the sort of highbrow art form within literature. Unusually, Shakespeare himself oversaw the printing of these works, which he didn't normally do. So both the works are derived from Ovid, which Shakespeare had read at school, and at one point he actually tutored classics as well. They're the only works for which he wrote dedications, both being addressed to Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton. Now, interestingly, some of Shakespeare's sonnets may also have been written to Southampton. Britannica suggests that the nobleman figure in the sonnets whose family are urging him to marry may be Southampton, and says, as the sonnets stand, they tell a coherent and disturbing tale. The poet experiences sex as something that fills him with revulsion and remorse, at least in the lustful circumstances in which he encounters it. His attachment to the young man is a love relationship that sustains him at times more than the love of the dark lady can do. And yet this loving friendship also dooms the poet to disappointment and self-hatred. Whether the sequence reflects any circumstances in Shakespeare's personal life, it certainly is told with an immediacy and dramatic power that bespeak an extraordinary gift for seeing into the human heart and its sorrows. And that's the thing with Shakespeare. He describes emotions so well that we tend to assume he must have experienced them himself, but we actually don't really know that. Now, romances, and romance doesn't mean a sort of Mills and Boon's sickly love story. It's something a lot more specific, as we're going to find out. In fact, Dr. Deborah Schwartz from California Polytechnic University says romance was not a generic classification in Shakespeare's time. So romance is not a genre at that point. The modern term romance refers to a new kind of play, a hybrid of comic and tragic elements developed and popularised by Francis Beaumont and John Fletcher between 1607 and 1613. Their Philaster, 1609, is typical of the genre. At the end of his theatrical career, Shakespeare wrote 4 such plays, which are now commonly grouped together as the romances. And these are Pericles, which appeared between 1607 and 1608, Cymbeline, 1609 to 1610, The Winter's Tale, 1610 to 1611, and the most famous of them is probably The Tempest, which appeared in 1611. The commercially successful A Midsummer Night's Dream, which appeared in 1595 to 6, may also be seen as a romance in a certain light. Like other romances, the plot is concluded with a marriage, similarly to a Shakespearean comedy ending in a marriage. Fairy magic and classical references dominate A Midsummer Night's Dream and appear in the romances. We especially see magic in The Tempest. Prospero is probably Shakespeare's most famous magician. Around this time, Shakespeare also concluded the historical plays with Henry V, so his writing is quite diverse around this period in history. Going back to the romances, The Winter's Tale contains similar threads to those history plays that he was writing at the time. King Leontes executes his wife Hermione, whom he wrongly believes has cuckolded him. He gives away their daughter Perdita, which means lost one, with whom he eventually becomes reconciled. Hermione, though, it turns out in the end has survived. Spoiler alert if you haven't read the play. And they are also reconciled. So unlike the real history, there is a happy ending. Cymbeline tells the story of the daughter of a king, Imogen, who's sent into exile when her father disapproves of her marriage to Posthumus Leonatus. So there is also a spoiled child in the play, Clotus, whose behaviour threatens the outcome for Imogen. The Tempest, of course, is arguably the most famous of the romances, as we said before. It again looks at a father-daughter relationship where the mother is missing. Prospero, who is a magician, causes a storm to shipwreck Ferdinand, who is his marriage choice for his daughter Miranda. This marriage will end a dispute between Milan and Naples. Prospero happened to be exiled to the island after his brother Antonio usurped the dukedom of Milan. Ferdinand and Miranda fall in love, but supernatural intervention from spirits such as Ariel play a part. Thus we have the story of the natural man, Caliban, the native, who must be freed by the end. And there is arguments that that is a very colonialist idea, uncomfortable with modern audiences. Shakespeare may have intended this play to have been his last. Now, the problem plays. They are a bit of a problem. From 1599 to 1605, Shakespeare wrote his so-called problem plays, and they don't fit easily into any given genre. These three plays are All's Well That Ends Well, Measure for Measure, and Troilus and Cressida. All's Well That Ends Well is a bit like a comedy, but covers difficult ethical issues. Count Bertram is married to Helena, a woman whose social status is inferior to his own, but has won him by her seemingly miraculous care of the King of France. He cannot commit to the responsibilities of marriage, though, and intends to seduce a young Florentine woman, Diana. Helena substitutes herself for Diana at the agreed assignation, a so-called bed trick, pretending to be the other woman, and calls her husband to account when she becomes pregnant. This differs greatly from the happy ending of most of the comedies, which resolve with a marriage. So not an all-out tragedy, but certainly not a comedy either. Measure for Measure also employs the so-called bed trick. Isabella, set on becoming a nun, is ordered to sleep with Lord Angelo, the deputy ruler of Vienna, in order to save her brother Claudio's life. The Duke in disguise substitutes Isabella for Mariana, with whom Angelo had been betrothed, but ended the relationship because she had no dowry. The nature and meaning of marriage is questioned, and the plot of the play means it cannot possibly end with a marriage, that just couldn't happen, or the restoration of a marriage relationship. So again, how do we fit it into a genre? Troilus and Cressida, 1601 to 2, is even further from any established genre. It concludes with the death of Patroclus and Hector, as in those famous figures from Homer's Iliad. And the approaching defeat of the Trojans is also coming. In this backdrop, lovers Troilus and Cressida are separated by war and bitter about the failure of their relationship. It's not a tragedy in that its protagonists don't actually die at the end, but it's certainly not a laugh riot. Another area of interest of Shakespeare's classical history. So Julius Caesar, one of his most famous classical plays, was written in 1599 or maybe 1600 for the opening of the Globe Theatre, and it's clearly a tragedy. The lines, "Men may construe things after their fashion, clean from the purpose of the things themselves," which comes from Act 1, Scene 3, lines 34 to 35, in case you're interested, encapsulate the play's focus on divine will and human action. Its themes are very Renaissance. You're starting to get the emergence at this period in history of a thing called Renaissance humanism, which is not what we think of as humanism today. It was not atheism, but the idea that individuals were more in control of their own destiny than had been believed in the medieval period, when God was seen to be responsible for everything that happened to you. The characters are resolutely classical in Julius Caesar, but the themes are very much Renaissance. Antony and Cleopatra, my favourite play by Shakespeare, I have to admit, was also written in 1606. Its source is Plutarch, and in it we see the triple pillar of the world transformed into a strumpet's full. So one of the triumvirate, the three men who are ruling the Roman Empire, falls for the wayward queen Cleopatra and starts to lose his power. And it's a story of duty, power and love and how those things come into conflict. Coriolanus from 1608 shows the ungrateful response of a city to a military hero, according to Britannica. Encouraged by his mother, Coriolanus takes on a political role in Rome, to which he is not really suited. He looks down upon his citizens. He is exiled but returns with Aufidius to capture the city. His mother pleads for her own life and those of other Romans, and he relents, falling into defeat. Pericles, 1606-8, is a romance based on the story of Apollonius of Tyre. It may have been co-written and it's not included in the 1623 folio, so it has a bit of a question mark over it as a work of Shakespeare. Pericles believes that his wife has died at sea and has her body thrown overboard and fosters out his daughter, only to be reunited with them both many years later. So that's a little bit of a background to the writings of Shakespeare. Now we've come to the key point, the top 10. Which are the top 10 Shakespeare texts that you should read to really be able to say that you know something about Shakespeare? Number 10, the sonnets. They're a great way to start with Shakespeare because they will get you used to the language easily, and it's like shorter chunks of texts, so they're a very good starting place. Number 9, King Lear. Perhaps the most depressing of his plays, but the interplay between King Lear and his daughters, it just works through the ages, that family dynamic and that sort of uncomfortable theme of growing older. Number 8, The Tempest. You've got it all here. You've got that father-daughter relationship again, but you've got the supernatural, you've got shipwrecks, you've got spirits. It does have that uncomfortable edge of colonialism, but if you can see past that and you can look at a Shakespearean Renaissance interpretation of that, it's a very enjoyable play. Antony and Cleopatra, because Cleopatra is just an amazing protagonist. She does like to throw the odd strop. She's very dramatic, but she is as captivating to the reader or to the viewer as she was to Antony. Twelfth Night. It applies to the Renaissance period, but also the ideas of gender are very relevant to audiences today. A Midsummer Night's Dream, again a tale of fairies and magic, and it is a gentle and enjoyable story. Venus and Adonis, for its raw sexuality and again for its views on the relationships between genders. It's really worth reading. Number 3, Double Trouble, Boil and Bubble, Macbeth. Macbeth being a very short play for Shakespeare, but still managing to say quite a lot in that time. It doesn't have sort of tangential subplots all over the place. It's very much focused on Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. It is chilling and it really makes you think about power and what power does to the human soul, and about tyranny and how to combat tyranny. The Winter's Tale, again, if you like all things supernatural, if you're a bit of a fantasy fan, if you want to see statues coming to life on stage, and Shakespeare put a bear costume to great use, it's worth watching as well as reading The Winter's Tale. Number 1, of course, because it just has to be read, Hamlet. At the apex of the English literary canon for a reason. The drawing of character, not just of the central character, but of all the characters, is just amazing. It's timeless. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please do subscribe if you'd like to keep watching Essential Reading, and I'll see you on the next episode.